Amida Buddha vowed to bring us all to become Supreme Buddha. Supreme Buddha is formless, and because of being formless is called Jinan. As for Jinan, Ji means of itself, not through the practicer's calculation. It signifies being made so. Nen means to be made so, not through the practicer's calculation. It is through the working of Amida Buddha's vow. Buddha, when appearing with form, is not called Supreme Nirvana. In order to make it known that Supreme Buddha is formless, the name Amida Buddha is expressly used. So I have been taught. Amida Buddha fulfills the purpose of making us know the significance of Jinan. From Hymns of the Dharma Ages, section titled On Jinan Honi. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu. Well, good evening, everyone. I'd like to talk about, well, what does Jodo Shinshu mean to me via Buddhism, sports, and great naturalness. Buddhism, sports, and great naturalness. You know, a peak experience, how many of you play golf? Yeah. When you had that peak experience in golf, it's the most intense and it's the most joyous. I think it's the most memorable moment that one can have in an individual's life. And its foundation is this personal subjective experience, a personal subjective experience upon which we can build abstract knowledge. And that foundation of abstract knowledge that in which we can build is that of religion and spirituality. But these experiences are very often difficult to communicate because our language, we don't possess the vocabulary to be able to communicate the depth in all accuracy and the vastness. But the fact of the matter is, according to the top scholars of the human brain, they say that we cannot tell people really what we're thinking because we, according to scientists, really don't know what we're thinking. And our deepest thoughts, the ones that account for our behavior on the conscious level, or are actually unconscious. And not only that, our thoughts are primarily visual as well, and we don't think in words. Even though we think and then we come out with words, we think that our thoughts are actually using words, but they're not actually visual instead. And certainly this makes it very difficult to communicate this peak experience that I'm talking about because we don't possess the vocabulary to express these emotional qualities. And the same can be said for our religious experience, and so efforts to describe Nembutsu, Namo Amida Butsu, efforts to describe the qualities of Amida Buddha, efforts to describe the word Shinjin, for example, will always be sufficient, and we will never have the last word. We will never, ever have the last word. But I think that experience parallels to that of being in love. And let us take an example of a young man who's had astonishing success with the favor of females. And although he's gifted, he's really young. And he brags to his buddies that he has things under control, and he begins to take the female world for granted because he's lost in his arrogance that he knows women. But finally, he meets a female. He meets a female who breaks down his carefully constructed theories, who refuses to allow him to reduce her to his formula. And shattered, this is the experience, shattered, he enters into the deep awe at the very nature and mystery of what he's taken for granted. And suddenly, every moment and every encounter becomes an invitation into astonishment and delight. Because I think only when we're really surprised in the presence of a person or a thing are we truly in love. And no matter how intimate we become, no matter how many years we've been married, our surprise continues. And without question, we come to know the beloved better, and we're able to speak central truths about him or her or it. But there's never a statement. There's never a final statement. Never do we arrive at the final word. But there are further surprises because I believe that to be in love is to be in awe of the infinite depth of things. To be in love is to be in awe of the infinite depth of things. Mercy Eliade, Mysterium, tremendum et fascinans, right? The mystery, the trembling within the midst of the fascination. But I think this is also in some way alludes to the Jodo Shinshu experience. And in sports, many athletic training programs have historically focused on the physical body, but we overlook the fact that the athlete, for example, represents more than just the workings of the human body. That performance is linked to the total individual, but only when studied from a total experience can the experience of an athlete be improved. And so in sports, there's this absence of dichotomization between mind and body, and so it is within Jodo Shinshu. There's this aspect of non-discrimination as described in the larger sutra when describing the qualities of the Pure Land, which alludes to the qualities of ultimate and true and real life, of reality itself, and how it's played out in the secular world. And I like to explain this by talking about my experience studying at the Nishihonganji Seminary in Japan, Chuo Bukkyo Gakuin, or other words known as Chubutsu, or Central Japan Buddhist Academy. However, through my explanation, I'd like to ask you for you to do one thing for me. While you're listening to my explanation, please focus. I'd like to ask you to focus on the content of my experience and not on me. Even though this is my story, I'd like you to not concentrate on me, the person, but on the content of my experience. Prior to leaving for Japan, I prepared through doctrinal studies in the United States, in addition to Japanese language studies, 3 years at Cal State Fullerton undergraduate. Got a 4.0 in Japanese. Went to the Monterey Institute of International Studies for summer intensive language, aced that. Went to, and that's the second best language school in the United States next to the Defense Language Institute in Monterey. And then finally to Ryukoku Daigaku, Ryukoku University, where I studied for 9 months, almost a year, Japanese studies, intensive Japanese. Again, 4.0 grade point average. But I'm afraid that my poor actual usage doesn't at all reflect my grade point average. You would think I've never took Japanese lessons. But I recall my first day at the seminary feeling totally lost and totally confused. And the language that they used was formal as opposed to the daily language that I learned in school. In addition to this, Buddhism has its own vocabulary with much of the syllabary that's indecipherable to even modern Japanese readers. But being the only foreigner in the class, the only gaijin in the class, and though having lived in Japan when I was young with my relatives and my family, learning how things worked in Japan was part of this large learning curve, and I'm still learning how these things work. But I was very fortunate to have as a classmate somebody who was half my age, he was a very kind and very, very helpful friend, and he helped me fill in the reading for the kanji that I didn't know. And no matter how fast I tried to copy the kanji off the board, I couldn't keep up, so I'd have blank spaces, and after school he'd help me fill in the blank spaces so I could study that night. And so, and though he didn't speak any English, and my Japanese was very poor, and it still is, if it wasn't for him, I don't think I would have graduated. But though I had a degree and I had significant professional experience, I had worked in the space program, in addition to an international, Swedish international telecommunications concern. But my friend just completed middle school. And at less than half my age, here was this 16-year-old sensei, he was my sensei. And he was someone who was light years ahead of me in studies, he was light years ahead of me in comprehension, and he was light years ahead of me in spirituality. Because there was something about him, just that quality within him, that was far beyond anything I had. But his patience and compassion was, and is still, beyond my own patience and compassion. And today we're still good friends, though we still can't speak each other's language, but somehow we're still friends, and oh well, there's Google Talk. But I realized that in spite of my education experience, I was the most ignorant and the most incapable in all the school. And I felt so ashamed. I felt such a huge sense of shame, because it's one thing to be ignorant and incapable, it's another thing to be self-centered and arrogant on top of that. And I was all of those things, I still am. But prior to this, like I said, I took pride in the fact that I worked in the space program. I received numerous academic awards and scholarships for college. And I'm a product of a mother who's Japanese and born in Kyoto, and my father who is of German descent. And so all that, taking pride in all that, being connected to all that, all those things, and all that pride that was built up to my 32 years of life at that time all together. So all these things, you kind of depend upon. They're like, how we're connected, what keeps us standing. But all this identified who I was and what I depended on to keep my ego healthy, okay, and afloat, in times of doubt and in times of great suffering. But suddenly, none of this mattered. It didn't matter the fact that I saw myself as a father. It never mattered that I saw myself as a husband. It never mattered that I saw myself as an ex-space program computer programmer. It never, none of this ever mattered. It didn't matter that I was a Japanese and German ancestry. None of that mattered, because none of it could help me in the most difficult in the time. And so there sat my wife, having given up her MSW program, Masters in Social Welfare, from Washington State University to go because I wanted to go to Japan and study. And my daughter having to learn a new language, Japanese, and in addition to that, learning a new culture, even though my wife is Japanese, in a foreign country. And we sold our house, we sold our car, and we donated all of our things. So we had absolutely nothing. So I had nothing to go back to. And there I was in the worst situation I felt of my life. And for the very first time in my life, I felt everything psychologically stripped away from me. All those things that I depended upon were stripped away from me, just like you would slice off all the branches off of the tree. And now I was left with nothing on which to depend. My attachments to how I identified and how I consoled myself is useless, and I myself have no other redeeming value. So every day, I rode my bicycle to school, and I dreaded going to school. For example, it's another day of mistakes. I remember taking the final exam for one class. I wrote for 2 hours, kanji, bakkari, right? Kanji, writing for 2 hours. And then at the end of 2 hours, it was when the sensei came around, he goes, "Let me see you outside a second." I said, "Okay." He goes, "You answered the wrong question." That time, really, tears came to my eyes. Tears came to his eyes too, because he was so sad for me. But something indescribable happened, and I'll try to put this into words the best way I can. I was walking up to the school, and there was 2 rows of hedges. The cicadas, the semi, in Japan in the summertime, really, really loud, right, like in stereo. And so I remember hearing the cicadas, and suddenly I stopped. And tears came to my eyes. And I thought, oh no, I'm having a mental breakdown. I'm going crazy. Then all of a sudden, everything for me fell silent. Everything fell silent. And I heard this voice in my heart, not in my ears, because then you might be schizophrenic, but I heard this voice in my heart saying to me, "I have been here all along. I have been here all along. I have always been here. I have always supported you. I am at the very fundamental basis of your life. And I've always will be, and I'm always there at the fundamental basis of your existence, supporting you, supporting your existence." And my heart, having received this voice, was followed by the recognition that not only was I embraced, that voice was the voice of Amida Buddha, but in the same time of complete stillness, no calculating thought, no thought whatsoever, I can sense. We talk about the Buddhas of the 10 directions, billions and billions of Buddha lands, billions of Buddhas in their Buddha lands surrounding me, and there's Amida, and they're all praising Amida Buddha to their own heart. And I understood then that the presence of the Buddhas of the 10 directions isn't a metaphor. It isn't a fairy tale. It isn't some Asian story, nor is Amida Buddha. They are real and true. The Buddhas of the 10 directions and Amida Buddha are real and true. Not as an anthropomorphic being, but as true life, as the Pure Land. But within this message came the understanding that the reason I had been blind to this great compassion was because of my reliance on my own calculating thought, because everything I calculate is for my own benefit. I calculate in order to make things for my own benefit or for my own ego. And most significantly, though, my attachments and my pride. But it was a moment of great clarity, and it was even physical sight. Even my physical sight, I felt, became so sharp. Everything became so clear. And I could see the 2 colors, but I would not make a discrimination between the 2 colors. They were there, but there was no sense of looking at as two different things. So my mind was without a single thought or calculation. There was no differentiation in objects, but they still retained their original form. And this for me was the experience of oneness. And this for me was the experience of great naturalness. And I stood in silence for that moment. And then the worst thing happened. I thought to myself, when you have an experience like this, you're supposed to say, Namo Amida Butsu. Immediately calculating, the bubble burst, and it never returned ever again. The bubble burst. Because why did I think of that, to say Namo Amida Butsu? Because I wanted to stay attached to that experience. I wanted that for myself. I wanted that for my ego. I wanted that through my own self-power. And that's what pushed me away from it. And that's what locked me out of it. Since that experience, when I studied the writings of Shinran showing everything all of a sudden came alive, I'd come home and everything came alive. It's as if I'd been trying to read his teachings in the dark, and all of a sudden I had a flashlight or somebody to light the way. And I came out of the experience. I'm still my foolish, petty, self-centered, arrogant, angry, greedy, and hateful self. But my experience made me realize that the experience of true religion, it isn't about becoming a better person. That is not the true reason for religion. It is not about morality. It is not about becoming quiescent or nihilistic. It isn't to use religion as a tool for everyday life. Because focusing in on these things, I think, would be changing $20 billion or $1 trillion of gold for $25 in cash, just so you can buy a soda out of the pot machine, right? But the Pure Land isn't tens of thousands of miles to the west. The Pure Land isn't up there. It isn't tens of thousands of miles, whichever way west is. But it isn't high up in the stars. It's not high up in space. But we live in the Pure Land. We live in the Pure Land, but we don't recognize this fact because our blind passions are so intense. Our self-calculation, our hold on the ego is so intense that it always blinds us to that, but we live within the Pure Land. But because we can't consciously create this experience, I believe they are rare indeed, at least for me. Maybe I'm sure other people have had many of these, but for me, it's only one time happened in my life. But it's the same is true in sports. The circumstances need not be out of the ordinary for this peak experience to occur. The uniqueness lies in the way that we experience the phenomenon. But Buddhism also speaks to this because Buddhism doesn't existence itself. Buddhism addresses the phenomenon of existence. And just as in sports, the peak experience, and just as in sports and religion, the peak experience is involuntary. You can't meditate your way to this point. You can't do good deeds to get you to this point. It's involuntary. You can't force it to happen again, just as I could never force my experience to materialize. The more I try, the further away I get. But I think this is likened to what is referred to in Buddhism as Jinen, the great naturalist I talked about at the beginning. But it's like a sudden cool day, in Hilo. It gets so hot and humid, right? And at the top of where the Hondo is, at the top platform, you can feel the sea breeze coming in. So I'm all sweaty and I'm all wet. So I stand in front of the doorway, in front of the Hondo, and that nice cool, all of a sudden the trade wind comes. And for one moment, it cools me off, It cools me off. And it's just a wonderful feeling. But there's nothing I could do to make it return. Just there's nothing I could do to make that breeze return. But I think so it is true as Shinjin, or what Dr. Tanaka described as awakening. For there's nothing we can consciously do to attain Shinjin. There's nothing we can constantly do to attain Shinjin in my belief. For I believe that the mind of Amida Buddha is the phenomenon itself. The mind of Amida Buddha is that whole realm of non-discrimination, non-calculation, where everything, and where you could hear the voice of this Buddha so clearly, but that this experience is temporary, I think points to the fact that in the secular world, in our world, it's impossible to completely affect complete and perfect enlightenment. It is impossible to do so until our physical body is discarded. And that's what Jodo Shinshu teaches, and I believe that is very much true. Because such is the unreliable waffling of the mind, and we're gripped by anger and desire, and the nature of the life that we have to live, that we have to make tons of judgments and calculations and think about every thought you thought. If I wrote down every thought I thought, I'd have to burn the book. I couldn't even write. I'd be too ashamed to look at it myself. But just as the peak experience is temporary, so is the phenomenon of this transcendence of self. And that when temporarily transcends oneself is to mean that there's a sense of ego transcendence, meaning that one becomes so involved in the experience itself and that, or the object of the game, that there's no longer a seer and there's no longer one that is seen. And one is no longer this separate self that's looking at the world. Rather, one merges into this phenomenon and we become one with the experience. And although we're totally involved with the experience, the sport or in the religious, spiritual experience, our effort is not involved. Our effort has to stay out of it because the experience itself is effortlessness. And this is also another characteristic, I think, of what we refer to as jinen, to mean great naturalness in Buddhism, and in conjunction with this, the one quality of tariki, or other power itself, that one is given focus in the activity as in harmony with it, parallels what I think is awakening to the mind that is sincere and true, awakening to the mind of Amida Buddha. That is a mind that is not distracted by other thoughts. This too is another aspect or quality of true and trusting, given to us by Amida Buddha, not made by us. So this peak experience too in sports has this quality of perfection of experience, and everything's right and everything's clicking, and you're going down court and you're ready to hit the ball and you can't hear the crowd cheering. It's just you don't even hear the ball, you don't even think about the art that you're throwing the ball, but it just goes perfectly into the basket. And this experience is memorable, and there's nothing that opposes one. The experience is memorable, just as I consider my spiritual experience worthwhile and beautiful. But because the normal self is transcended, all the problems of fears and difficulties of one's life is also transcended. And even if one loses the game or loses the contest, the wonder and the beauty and the experience supersedes the final score. It doesn't matter if we lost the game. And so it is with life. You know, in life, we may have not amassed a great amount of wealth at the end of our life. And if you're a minister, you never will. And you're never going to get any fame. If you don't have, most of us aren't going to be famous, and most of us aren't going to have lots and lots of power and anything like that. But we may have instead endured tremendous hardship within our lifetime. But we live within the embrace of eternal life. And it is there that we find the underlying beauty of life. It is there that we think at the moment of death, my feeling is at the moment when I die, I'm not going to be thinking of what did I accomplish in this life and who did I work for and what projects did I complete. I'll be thinking of all that just enabled me to live life. And that the life was the important thing, not the career, not the money, not the recognition, but it was that underlying life, that eternal life, that was the real treasure. So one, should possess the basic skills. to be able to make the fundamental skills. And one does not have to be an expert, because I'm not an expert at anything. But one just must be comfortable with some basic skills. I think that for us would be equivalent to listening to the Dharma. And this can be said of the Nenbutsu teachings also. One doesn't have to be a scholar, but to be able to hear the teachings is to be able to plant the seeds. We call it, in Buddhism, they call it the storehouse consciousness. And it's true, these seeds are planted. When you listen to the Dharma, these seeds are planted into this box. And then when the right causes and conditions occur within one's lifetime, those seeds sprout. They come to maturity. And then that's the aha moment, okay? So we plant the seeds that one day mature into this experience of hearing within our heart mind, not through our ears, but within our heart, this voice of Amida Buddha. And our response to that voice is Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu. But such is the case of life that we may not accomplish our social goals, we may not accomplish our economic goals or our personal goals, but we may be able to do something far greater, far greater, and far more invaluable, and that's to open up to the workings of the ultimate peak experience, Amida Buddha, who's always accessible and who's always calling. And that's what Jodo Shinshu is to me.